When the CEO announced that my job now belonged to her son, the entire room applauded. What none of them seemed to realize was that every federal contract keeping this company alive still had my name on it. My name is Maren Caldwell. I'm 46 years old, and for the past 18 years, I'd been the person quietly running federal logistics operations for Hargrove Freight Systems. Technically, the company belonged to my mother-in-law, Gloria Hargrove. In practice, I built the part of the business that actually made it profitable. The announcement happened during a Monday operations meeting. 14 managers sat around the long conference table. Dispatch reports were stacked in front of them. Someone had left a half-empty coffee cup next to the projector. Gloria stood at the head of the table with the confidence of someone who had already decided how the story would end. "We're entering a new phase of leadership," she said. "Effective immediately, my eldest son, Tate, will assume control of federal operations." A few people clapped automatically. Tate smiled like he had just won an award. I waited for Gloria to say something about my new role. Instead, she looked directly at me. "Family leadership keeps this company stable," she added. "Tate will take over your department. Across the table." My husband Evan shifted in his chair but said nothing. He had spent his entire life as the younger son in a family where decisions were rarely questioned. The room grew quiet in a very specific way, the kind of quiet where everyone understands something uncomfortable just happened. I folded my hands on the table. "What happens to the federal contracts I manage?" I asked. Gloria waved a hand dismissively. "Tate will handle those too." Several managers glanced at each other, because anyone who had ever worked with those contracts knew one detail Gloria apparently didn't. Every one of them listed a designated operational lead, and that lead was me. Before we go any further, and as usual, this story is a work of fiction created by our editorial team for storytelling purposes. All characters, events, and organizations are fictional. Any resemblance is purely coincidental. Thank you, and let's continue. So when my mother-in-law decided to replace me with her son in front of the entire company, did she have any idea what the contracts actually required? The meeting ended the way awkward meetings usually do. Too quickly and too quietly. Chairs scraped against the floor, laptops closed, people avoided eye contact as they gathered their papers and slipped out of the conference room one by one. Tate stayed behind with Gloria, already leaning over the table while she pointed at a spreadsheet like she was handing him the keys to an engine he had never actually driven. No one stopped me on the way back to my office. That part didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was how calm I felt. My office door closed with a soft click. I sat down, opened the lower drawer of my desk, and pulled out the thick federal contract binder I had assembled over the past several years. Inside were the 3 agreements that had quietly transformed Hargrove Freight from a regional trucking company into a government logistics partner. Together, those contracts represented more than $9 million in annual revenue. I flipped to the first one and turned straight to the operations section. Not the executive summary, not the payment schedule. The operational compliance language most people skipped because it was written in dense federal contract wording that made eyes glaze over. Halfway down the page, and the clause appeared exactly where I remembered it. Designated operational lead. The line below it listed a name, mine. My personal phone number was printed there too. The same number that had rung countless times during late-night routing emergencies and federal audit calls. I opened the second contract and the same clause. The same name. The third contract took a few seconds longer to find. But when I reached the operational compliance page, the wording was even clearer. Continuity of the designated operational lead was considered part of performance compliance, if that role changed. The contracting agency had the right to initiate a review. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the page for a moment. Years ago, I had written that clause myself during negotiations. At the time, I thought I was protecting the company. What I hadn't realized was that I had also written something else into those contracts. Leverage. The question now was simple. When the government looked at those agreements, whose authority would they actually recognize by the time I got home that evening? The family group chat was already busy. The Hargroves had always treated the chat like a running bulletin board for family victories, birthdays, promotions, holiday plans. That night, the thread was full of congratulatory messages. "Proud of you. Tate, finally the company is in the next generation's hands. Your father would be thrilled to see this." There was even a photo Gloria had posted from the conference room earlier that morning. Tate standing at the head of the table, sleeves rolled up like he had just stepped into the role through hard work instead of inheritance. I read the messages without responding. A minute later, my phone buzzed again. A private message from Evan. I'm sorry about today. 3 words. They hung there on the screen, longer than they should have. A second message appeared. You know how my mother is. If I had pushed back in that room, it would have turned into a war. I typed a reply and erased it twice before finally sending something simple. I understand. That wasn't entirely true, but arguing about it wouldn't change anything. Instead, I set the phone down and walked to my desk in the corner of the living room. My laptop was still open from earlier. The federal contract file sat on the screen exactly where I had left it. I scrolled down to the operations section. The clause appeared again. Designated operational lead. My name printed directly beneath it. I reached for my phone and took a photo of the screen. Then I opened the family chat. For a moment, I just watched the typing bubbles appear and disappear as the conversation continued without me. Finally, I tapped the image icon and uploaded the photo. No caption, no explanation, just the page. The message posted instantly. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the typing bubbles vanished. The chat went completely silent. 30 seconds later, my phone vibrated again. A private message from Gloria. What exactly are you trying to say with that picture? I looked back at the contract page before answering. Just making sure everyone understands how the contracts work. Another long pause followed. Which made me wonder something. Had anyone in that family ever actually read the agreements that kept their company running? The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The dispatch floor was still quiet. A few screens glowed in the dim light, showing route maps and delivery schedules updating automatically as trucks moved across the Midwest. From the outside, the system looked simple. Loads entered, routes appeared, dispatchers confirmed assignments, drivers received their instructions. Efficient, predictable, reliable. What most people didn't realize was that the software managing those routes wasn't actually the dispatch platform the company had purchased years ago. The real engine sat underneath it. I logged into my laptop and opened the folder where the routing optimization system lived. Thousands of lines of code and routing models filled the screen tools I had started building during my second year with the company, long before Hargrove Freight had any serious IT infrastructure. Back then, the company had 6 trucks and a scheduling board on the wall. Fuel costs were chaotic. Drivers doubled back across states. Dispatchers relied on instinct more than data. So I started experimenting on weekends. The system gradually evolved into something far more powerful than the original plan. It calculated fuel efficiency, traffic patterns, hub capacity, and driver compliance hours all at once. Over the years, it quietly became the backbone of the operation. 90 trucks now moved according to decisions made by that system. Fuel expenses dropped nearly 20% after its first major upgrade. Delivery times improved enough that federal agencies started taking notice. And yet most people in the building assumed the efficiency came from better management. Tate certainly did. To him, the routes simply appeared each morning like weather forecasts, something the company owned because it existed inside the company. I scrolled down through the files for a moment before opening another document. My original employment contract. I had reviewed it years ago during a salary discussion, but this time I read it slowly, line by line. Compensation, duties, confidentiality. One section was noticeably absent. There was no intellectual property assignment clause, no statement transferring software ownership to the company. The routing system had never been formally purchased. It had never been licensed. Legally speaking, it had never belonged to Hargrove Freight at all, which raised a very uncomfortable question. If the system guiding every profitable route wasn't actually theirs, what exactly had the company been relying on all these years? The official notice arrived the next morning. It came from HR, not from Gloria. A short internal memo appeared in my inbox at 8:12 a.m., copied to half the management team. Effective immediately, federal operations oversight will transition to Tate Hargrove as part of the company's leadership restructuring. All agency communications should now be directed through his office. I read the message once, then closed the window. Across the building, Tate was already moving fast. Within an hour, he had sent introduction emails to several federal procurement officers. The tone was enthusiastic and confident, exactly the kind of message a newly promoted executive might write after a leadership change. I'm excited to take over operational coordination moving forward, looking forward to strengthening our partnership. On the surface, nothing about those emails was unusual, except for one detail. Every one of those agencies had signed contracts containing the same operational clause. continuity of the designated operational lead, and those contracts listed a specific name. Not Tate's. Mine. By late morning, the first reply arrived. It came from a procurement officer at the Department of Transportation who had worked with our team for nearly 4 years. The email was short and polite. Before we proceed with upcoming scheduling approvals, can you confirm whether the designated operational lead on the contract has changed? If so, please provide updated compliance documentation. Tate forwarded the message to me 20 minutes later. Do you know what paperwork they're asking for? I stared at the screen for a moment before replying. The contract requires notification if the operational lead changes. Another message came back quickly. Great. Can you send that to them? I leaned back in my chair. Technically, notifying the agency was part of my responsibility under the agreement, so I opened a new email and drafted a formal update. The message didn't accuse anyone of anything. It didn't criticize the company. It simply informed the agency that my operational responsibilities at Hargrove Freight were changing, which meant the contract's continuity clause might require review. I read the email once more and then pressed send. Across the building, Tate was still celebrating his new position. He had no idea that the moment he introduced himself to those agencies, the contracts had quietly moved into compliance review. And once a federal contract entered that process, one question always came first. Could the company still meet the terms it had signed? The call came the following afternoon. My phone buzzed while I was reviewing route reports at my desk. The number on the screen carried a Washington, D.C. area code I recognized immediately. Federal procurement offices rarely called without a reason. I stepped into the hallway before answering. Good afternoon, the voice on the line said. This is Daniel Reeves from the Department of Transportation Logistics Oversight Division. His tone was calm, professional, the same tone used in every compliance conversation I had handled over the years. We received your operational status update yesterday. He continued. I wanted to clarify something before our internal review proceeds. I leaned against the wall beside the window. What would you like to confirm? I asked. Are you still the designated operational lead for the Hargrove Midwest Corridor contract? The question was straightforward, but the answer required precision. My internal role at the company has recently changed, I said carefully. Federal operations are now being transitioned to another executive. There was a brief pause on the line. Understood, Reeves replied. In that case, we'll need confirmation from the contracting organization regarding continuity of the operational lead requirement. That was the exact language written in the contract. We'll coordinate with them, I said. Appreciate it, he replied. Our review team will likely request additional documentation in the next few days. The call ended politely, the way federal conversations always did. But the moment I slipped my phone back into my pocket, I knew something had already shifted. Across the building, Tate was still moving through meetings like a newly promoted executive introducing himself to managers, reviewing spreadsheets, talking about strategy. He probably believed the government call was routine. Meanwhile, back in the legal department, 2 floors down, an email from the Department of Transportation had just landed in the company's compliance inbox. Subject line operational lead verification request. Inside the dispatch center, small delays had already started appearing on a few federal shipments waiting for routing approvals. Nothing dramatic. Just the kind of quiet administrative friction that appeared when agencies started asking questions. And federal agencies had a habit of asking very specific ones, which made me wonder how long it would take before someone in the company realized what those questions actually meant. The emergency meeting started at 7:30 the next morning. Gloria rarely scheduled meetings before 9 unless something had already gone wrong. By the time I walked past the glass conference room on the way to the operations floor, most of the senior staff were already inside. The blinds were half drawn, but through the gap I could see Gloria standing at the head of the table, one hand pressed flat against a stack of printed emails. Voices were louder than usual. 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a message from Phil in dispatch. They're losing it upstairs. That wasn't surprising. Because by that point, 3 separate federal procurement offices had sent the same request. Verification of the designated operational lead. Inside the conference room, the conversation had apparently shifted from confusion to concern. Phil sent another message. Legal just said the contract actually names you. I could almost picture the moment the company lawyer reached that line. A few minutes later, the door opened and one of the compliance managers stepped into the hallway to make a call. His voice carried farther than he probably realized. The clause is enforceable, he said into the phone. If the operational lead changes, the agency has the right to pause approvals until compliance is verified. Inside the room, chairs scraped, Tate's voice rose above the others. It's just a technicality, he insisted. We'll send them a new contact name. The lawyer answered immediately. That's not how the clause works. The room went quiet again. Because the contract didn't just require a contact name, it required continuity of the person responsible for operational oversight. And for several years, that person had been the same one listed in every contract. Me. Meanwhile, another problem was beginning to surface downstairs. Without the routing system's daily adjustments, dispatchers had started routing trucks manually. Fuel estimates were off, delivery windows were tightening. None of it looked catastrophic yet, but the margins were already shifting, which meant the meeting upstairs was about to confront two separate realities at the same time: the legal clause they had ignored and the operational system they didn't fully understand. The real question was no longer whether the company had made a mistake. It was how expensive that mistake was about to become. The restaurant sat just off the interstate outside Columbus, the kind of place truck drivers favored because the parking lot was big enough for a full rig and nobody rushed you out of your seat. Scott Langford was already there when I arrived. He stood when I approached the table, offering a firm handshake and a nod that felt more like respect than politeness. I was starting to think you'd never call, he said with a small grin. Scott ran Midland Transport, one of the few regional logistics companies that had quietly expanded without drowning itself in debt. We had crossed paths at industry conferences over the years, mostly brief conversations about routing margins and federal compliance headaches. He had always asked good questions, the kind that told you someone actually understood the work. We ordered food and skipped most of the small talk. So, he said after the waitress walked away, I assume something interesting happened at Hargrove. That's one way to put it. He leaned back slightly. I'm not going to ask you to share anything confidential, but I will say this: people in this industry know who actually builds the operations. I said nothing. Scott slid a folder across the table. Inside was a short proposal. Senior Vice President of Operations, $195,000 base salary, profit sharing, oversight of 3 regional hubs. But the second page was the part that caught my attention. Technology acquisition proposal. We understand you've developed a routing optimization system, Scott said calmly. If it was built independently, so we'd like to acquire it formally. Fair valuation. Your name on the filing. For a moment, I just looked at the paper. In 18 years at Hargrove, nobody had ever asked about the system that way. It had simply existed. Used. Relied upon. Taken for granted. Scott continued. We're also preparing a federal bid for the Midwest Corridor contract next quarter. If you came aboard, you'd be leading that effort. Outside the window, a line of trucks rolled slowly across the lot toward the highway. For the first time since the meeting with Gloria, the situation felt very clear. At Hargrove, I had spent years proving my value inside a structure that didn't recognize it. Across the table sat someone who already did, which left only one real question. What happens to a company when the person who built its systems decides to work somewhere else? 3 months later, the Midwest Logistics Corridor contract entered its renewal cycle. 2 companies submitted bids, Hargrove Freight and Midland Transport. From the outside, it looked like a routine competition. Federal agencies reviewed proposals every year, comparing cost structures, delivery reliability, and compliance records. Inside the industry, though, people understood something had shifted. At Midland, the routing optimization system had been fully integrated by the start of the quarter. Dispatch teams now planned routes using the same predictive models I had spent years refining. Fuel consumption dropped within the first month. Late deliveries fell even faster. Those numbers went straight into Midland's federal bid documentation. Meanwhile, inside Hargrove Freight, things were moving in the opposite direction. Without the system's automated routing adjustments, dispatchers were back to estimating routes manually. The difference looked small at first: slightly longer travel times, slightly higher fuel estimates. But federal contracts were built on thin margins. Small inefficiencies stacked quickly. Then the compliance review reports arrived, because when the agencies re-examined the contracts earlier that quarter, they had noticed something else. The designated operational lead named in the agreements was no longer overseeing the operation. Hargrove's legal team had tried to explain the internal restructuring, but federal procurement offices cared less about corporate hierarchy than about contractual terms. Operational continuity mattered. Performance consistency mattered. And when those 2 things started drifting apart, procurement officers began comparing alternatives. Midland's bid arrived at exactly the right moment. Lower projected costs, higher delivery reliability, a routing methodology that demonstrated measurable efficiency improvements. The review process took several weeks. Then the award announcement appeared in the industry procurement bulletin. Midwest Corridor Logistics Contract. Awarded to Midland Transport. 3 years. $12 million. Inside Hargrove Freight. The reaction was immediate. Revenue projections shifted overnight. Cash flow forecasts tightened. A company that had quietly relied on federal contracts for stability suddenly had a hole in its balance sheet, which forced the leadership team into a conversation they had spent months avoiding. What happens when the operation you built your business around suddenly works better? Somewhere else, 6 months after the contract award? The signing meeting took place in a quiet federal procurement office in Chicago. No applause, no speeches. Federal contracts rarely came with ceremony. They came with documentation. The procurement officer slid the final agreement across the table. "Congratulations," he said. "Your operational proposal outperformed the previous contractor by a clear margin." I reviewed the last page carefully before signing, not because I expected surprises, but because I had spent enough years in this industry to respect what contracts actually meant. Across the top of the operational section sat a line I had seen many times before: designated operational lead. This time, the name printed beside it didn't appear quietly inside someone else's company paperwork. It appeared directly under my own position at Midland Transport. The officer tapped the page lightly. "Your routing methodology was one of the deciding factors," he said. "Our evaluation team appreciated the transparency in your operational modeling." I signed the document. The moment felt strangely calm. Not triumphant, just clear. In the months since the contract loss, Hargrove Freight had been forced to restructure its finances. Industry news eventually confirmed that the company had sold 40% of its ownership to a regional competitor to stabilize cash flow. Gloria stepped back from daily operations shortly afterward. Tate remained in a reduced management role. I didn't follow the details closely, and I didn't need to, because the real difference between then and now wasn't the contract. It was the structure surrounding the work. At Midland, the system I built had been purchased properly. My name appeared in the operational documentation. The responsibilities were clear. For the first time in my career, the credit matched the work, and the lesson behind that change turned out to be simple. Family can give leadership roles to people who share their blood, but federal contracts only trust the person who can actually run them. Thank you for listening. If this story made you stop and think, hit like to support, subscribe for more stories like this, and leave a comment with your perspective. We read every one. 8 months building the most important project in our company. And the CEO handed it to an intern overnight. The strange part was, he had no idea who would hear about it first. And by the end of the day, the entire board would know. I didn't know that yet at 7:12 a.m., when the executive floor of MedAccess Health Systems was almost empty and Manhattan's skyline reflected across the glass walls. The city below was just beginning to wake up. Something in the system had changed overnight. I just didn't know what yet. My name is Naomi Heller. I'm 46 years old, and for the last 8 months, I had been leading the most ambitious project MedAccess had attempted in years, Asterion, a remote care platform designed to connect hospitals, clinics, and home patients across 3 states. Today was supposed to be the final rollout meeting, the win. I opened the project dashboard and checked everything one more time. The deck, the rollout map, milestones, vendor commitments. One email from a hospital partner caught my attention. "We're signing because Naomi's team proved this platform actually works." I leaned back in my chair for a moment. 8 months of negotiations, late nights, endless revisions. Then I noticed something strange. One of the internal folders was locked. I tried again. Access denied. That didn't make sense. I walked across the corridor to Colin Price, the CEO's chief of staff. "Colin, the vendor archive for Asterion just got restricted. Did something change?" He barely looked up from his tablet. "Executive visibility restructuring." That sounds vague. It's temporary. The tone of his voice made it clear the conversation was already over. I returned to my desk, uneasy. On the way to the conference wing, I saw someone I didn't expect. Lena Mercer, the new intern. She stepped out of the executive suite carrying a tablet that looked suspiciously like my presentation deck. Her badge flashed a level of access interns don't usually have. Two product managers walked past me in the hallway. Their voices dropped when they noticed me. She's been in the prep meetings all week. I thought Naomi knew what neither of them would meet my eyes. A strange feeling settled in my chest. Something had shifted inside this building. But I pushed the thought away. 8 months of work doesn't disappear overnight. Right before the meeting, I opened the internal agenda email one last time. My eyes scanned the leadership list, then stopped. The line that had carried my name for months was gone. Project Lead Asterion. Now it read, Strategic Advisor Lena Mercer. I stared at the screen, and one question formed immediately in my mind. When exactly had I been replaced? The hallway outside the executive conference wing was made entirely of glass. Glass walls, glass doors, glass reflections of people pretending not to watch. I caught Colin Price just as he stepped out of the CEO's office. Colin, he stopped, turning slowly. We need to talk. He glanced at his watch. Make it quick. I held up my phone. The agenda email still open. My name disappeared from the Asterion leadership list overnight. He barely reacted. That came from the CEO's office, but that's not an explanation, like it's the decision. The tone was calm, final. Since when does the CEO rewrite a project structure 12 hours before rollout? Colin's mouth twitched slightly. Since he decided the project needs fresh leadership? Fresh leadership. 8 months of work reduced to 2 words. Before I could answer, someone walked up behind us. Lena Mercer, the new intern. She carried a tablet against her chest, moving with the kind of quiet confidence interns usually don't have. The screen lit up for a moment. My presentation deck, the one I had finished at midnight. She gave me a small, composed smile. Morning, Naomi, she said. Then she added, almost casually, Adrian asked me to walk the board through the rollout today. For a second, the words didn't register. Colin nodded to her. Everything ready for the meeting, yes, and she replied easily. I reviewed the rollout timeline again. Reviewed it, the same way someone might review notes they wrote themselves. 2 product managers were standing near the coffee station behind us. One of them leaned slightly toward me as Lena walked past. She's been in executive prep meetings all week, he murmured. That's impossible, I replied. Interns didn't attend closed leadership sessions. He shrugged. Apparently someone made an exception. I watched Lena disappear toward the conference wing. And suddenly the last few months started lining up in my head. Adrian questioning my strategy in meetings, Colin quietly requesting copies of my working files, Lena showing up more and more often on the executive floor. This hadn't started today. It had been building for weeks, maybe longer. My phone buzzed. Mom. I stepped aside and answered. Naomi, honey, you sound stressed, Ruth said gently. It's nothing. Just get through the meeting, she replied. Don't make enemies at the top. I didn't respond, because something in my chest already knew the truth. If I stayed quiet today, the project I built would belong to someone else. The conference room door opened. Inside, the long glass table was already filling up. And right at the center, Lena Mercer was sitting in the chair reserved for the person leading the project. My chair. The conference room was already full when I walked in. Department heads lined the glass table. Legal observers sat along the wall. On the far screen, 3 partner hospitals were connected through video. No one spoke much. People shuffled papers, adjusted laptops, avoided eye contact. I placed my binder on the table and sat down anyway. If anyone was surprised to see me, they hid it well. A minute later, the door opened. Adrian Vale walked in. He didn't greet anyone, didn't take his usual seat immediately either. Instead, his eyes moved slowly across the table and then stopped on me. Let's begin. His tone was clipped, impatient. This project is being repositioned under fresh leadership. The words landed in the room like a dropped glass. I leaned forward slightly. Whose leadership? Adrian didn't look at me when he answered. He turned his head toward the other side of the table, toward Lena. Then he said it calmly, clearly. Lena Mercer will serve as strategic advisor on Asterion moving forward. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone whispered. The intern is someone at the far end of the table muttered under their breath. This is going to be a disaster. Adrian continued, ignoring the reaction. Naomi built the early framework, he said. But the final stage requires a different perspective. Sometimes the person who starts a project isn't the right person to finish it. His eyes finally moved back to me. You'll assist Lena during the transition. Even on the small phone screen, the room had gone completely silent. Assist. The word landed harder than anything else he'd said. 8 months building the project, and now I was being reassigned to support the intern sitting across from me. Lena lowered her eyes modestly. I'll do my best to continue Naomi's work, she said softly, but she didn't refuse, didn't hesitate, didn't even pretend the situation surprised her. At the far end of the table, someone lifted a phone. Not obviously, just enough for the camera lens to clear the laptop screen. Recording, I stood there for a moment, not arguing, not raising my voice, just looking at Adrian long enough for everyone in the room to notice something strange. I wasn't panicking. Finally, I spoke. Quietly. You might want to ask your wife first. A few people glanced at each other. Adrian let out a short laugh. Is that supposed to mean something I didn't answer? I simply gathered my folder, turned, and walked out of the room. In the hallway, I took out my phone. There was only one name on the screen, and it was the one person Adrian Vale would never expect me to call. So, I pressed it. The nearest empty meeting room was 2 doors down from the conference wing. I closed the glass door behind me and finally exhaled. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at my phone. Then I scrolled to the name I needed. Victoria Vale. The call rang twice. Naomi. Her voice was calm, professional, not surprised. We had worked together before several times. Actually, whenever the board's governance committee reviewed operational audits, I was the one preparing the data reports. Victoria always read those reports herself, line by line. She wasn't the kind of person who missed details. Victoria, I said, I'm calling because something just happened inside the Asterian rollout meeting. What kind of something? I didn't dramatize it. Didn't complain. I simply listed the facts. The project was reassigned. To whom? The intern. Silence. I continued. It happened in the executive conference room. Full leadership present. 3 hospital partners on video. Another pause. And several people were recording. Victoria didn't interrupt. So I added the final piece. The intern's name is Lena Mercer. This time the silence stretched longer. Everyone in the company had heard the rumor by now. About Adrian, about the intern. About... When Victoria spoke again, her voice had changed slightly. Colder. Was it documented? Yes. Phones? Yes. Room cameras? Yes. I could almost hear her thinking. Finally, she said, very evenly, do not send anything to Adrian. I wasn't planning to. Don't argue with HR either. Understood. And don't leave the building yet. That made me pause. You think this becomes something bigger? Victoria didn't answer directly. Instead, she said one final sentence. Thank you for telling me, Naomi. The line clicked off. I lowered the phone slowly. Victoria wasn't someone who reacted emotionally. She believed in systems, governance, mechanisms. Exactly 10 minutes later, the first sign appeared. Every director on the MedAccess board and the company's general counsel received the same email. Subject line, executive misconduct filing. The email moved faster than any announcement the company had ever sent. Within minutes, the executive floor felt different. Phones rang nonstop. Doors opened and closed in rapid bursts. Assistants hurried between offices carrying tablets like evidence bags. Colin Price walked past my desk twice in 10 minutes. The second time, he stopped. Legal wants to see you. Now. He didn't sound annoyed anymore. He sounded worried. The meeting room was smaller than the executive boardroom, just a glass table, 2 chairs, and a large screen on the wall. Inside were MedAccess's general counsel, Margaret Doyle, and the head of internal audit. Margaret gestured toward the chair across from her. Naomi, sit. I did. The screen behind her flickered on. For a moment, it showed a paused frame from the meeting earlier. Adrian standing at the table. Lena beside him. My chair empty. Margaret folded her hands. Before we go further, she said calmly, there's something you should understand about the company's governance structure. She tapped the tablet beside her. A document appeared on the screen. Vale family. Holding trust ownership structure, voting authority, the controlling shares of MedAccess, Margaret explained, are not held directly by the CEO. I looked up. They're held by the family trust. The head of audit nodded. And the trustee currently holding voting authority is Victoria Vale. I finished quietly. Margaret gave a small approving nod. Yes, meaning Adrian Vale ran the company, but he didn't actually control it. The screen changed again. Now it showed the meeting footage. Adrian's voice echoed through the room. You'll assist Lena during the transition. Margaret paused the video. We also reviewed HR records. Another document appeared. Lena Mercer's hiring file. Several compliance steps were missing. Conflict of interest checks bypassed. The audit director opened another folder: emails, internal calendar records, prep meetings for Asterion. 3 weeks of executive sessions where my name had quietly disappeared. Margaret leaned back slightly. Taken together, she said, this suggests favoritism, misuse of executive authority, and potential fiduciary exposure for the company. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. The data had already spoken. The door suddenly swung open. Adrian Vale stepped inside, furious. What the hell is this? He demanded. Shut this down immediately. Margaret didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at him, then said one sentence, and your wife already voted to convene the board. By the time the board assembled that evening, the building felt like it was holding its breath. Half the directors joined through video. The rest sat around the long walnut table in the main boardroom, faces lit by screens and spreadsheets. I wasn't part of the board, but Margaret Doyle, the general counsel, had asked me to remain in the room as a witness to the events earlier that morning. Adrian sat at the far end of the table, jaw tight, arms folded. Margaret began without ceremony. There are 3 issues the board needs to review. She tapped her tablet. The first slide appeared on the screen: use of executive authority to favor an employee with a personal relationship. Another slide: removal of a senior executive from a strategic project without process or performance review. The third slide lingered longer: exposure of the company to contractual risk by changing project leadership after external partners were assured of specific leadership capability. Several directors exchanged looks. One of them spoke from the screen. The hospital network signed specifically because of Naomi's role. Yes, Margaret replied calmly. And that assurance was removed this morning. Adrian leaned forward. This was a strategic reassignment, he said sharply. Leaders move people all the time. Another director spoke. Not when external partners were promised specific leadership. Margaret didn't respond immediately. Instead, she opened another document. This brings us to the fourth matter. The title on the screen read, Executive Compensation Agreement. She scrolled to a section highlighted in yellow. Mr. Vale's equity incentives and severance package include a morals and fiduciary clawback provision. A quiet ripple moved through the room. Margaret continued. If the board determines that the CEO has breached fiduciary duty or materially exposed the company to governance risk, any unvested equity compensation may be revoked. Adrian scoffed. You're suggesting this is a moral violation. Margaret turned the screen toward the board. The video from the meeting began playing. Adrian's voice echoed again. You'll assist Lena during the transition. The clip ended. The room stayed silent. Across the table, Adrian's expression had changed. For the first time that day, he looked uncertain. From one of the screens, a director asked quietly, Does the trustee support this review? Margaret answered without hesitation. The trustee authorized the emergency session. Adrian's eyes narrowed. Victoria doesn't make decisions about the board without consulting me. Margaret didn't blink. She already did. For the first time that evening, Adrian stopped talking. Around the table, several directors were already reviewing the voting documents. Victoria wasn't physically present in the room, but every motion being discussed carried her authority. The board chair finally spoke. We'll recess for 30 minutes before the vote. It was already close to midnight, and when the meeting resumed, they would decide whether the CEO still had a job when the market opened. By the time I returned to my office, most of the executive floor had gone quiet. The city outside Manhattan's glass towers glowed with late-night traffic. But inside MedAxis, the building felt suspended between 2 outcomes. I sat by the window, watching headlights crawl along the avenues far below. My phone buzzed. A message from a product manager who had been in the meeting that morning. Thought you should have this. A video file appeared in the chat. The meeting recording. The moment Adrian stood at the table and said, You'll assist Lena during the transition. Another message followed. Uploading it here in case someone tries to erase the internal copy. I typed back a simple response. Thank you. Across the executive floor, the quiet didn't last long. 2 analysts passed my office, speaking in low voices. He replaced her with the intern. In front of the hospital partners, someone recorded the whole thing. Doors opened and closed down the hallway. People who normally avoided each other were suddenly talking. The story was moving through the building faster than any internal memo. My phone rang again. Mom, Naomi, Ruth said the moment I answered. I heard there's some kind of investigation tonight. Nothing official yet. Maybe you should step back, she said quietly. Let the company sort it out. I looked out at the city lights. I'm not pushing this. Mom, what do you mean it's already moving? Across the building. That movement had already begun. Internal audit had requested Colin's access logs, his calendar history, every email thread referencing Lena Mercer. HR started reviewing Lena's hiring file. Within an hour, they discovered multiple approvals had bypassed the normal compliance workflow. Several of them signed directly from the CEO's office. No justification attached. In the boardroom, one director said what everyone else was thinking. If partners find out the project leadership changed because of a personal relationship, another director finished the sentence. The contract collapses. I didn't need to add anything else. The company was already calculating the risk Adrian had created. Sometime near dawn, exhaustion finally pulled me into the chair behind my desk. At 6:40 a.m., my phone vibrated again. A single message from Margaret Doyle. Come in early. A second message appeared a moment later. The vote passed. I arrived just after 7. The lobby of MedAccess looked normal at first glance, glass walls, polished marble, the quiet hum of early employees scanning badges at the security gates. But the air felt different. People were whispering. 2 analysts near the elevators stopped mid-sentence when I walked past. They voted last night. I heard it was unanimous. No one finished the thought. I stepped aside near the security desk, pretending to review emails. A few minutes later, the lobby doors slid open again. Adrian Vale walked in. Same tailored suit, same confident stride he used every morning. If he knew anything about the board's vote, he didn't show it. He approached the executive access gate and tapped his badge against the scanner. A red light flashed. Access denied. Adrian frowned slightly and tried again. The second red light stayed on longer. Another red flash. This time the sound from the scanner echoed across the lobby. Several people stopped walking. Someone near the reception desk whispered, "Is his badge actually disabled?" Adrian turned toward the security desk. "There's a problem with the system." Before the guard could answer, 2 senior security officers approached from the corridor behind the desk. "Mr. Vale," one of them said politely, "we're going to need you to come with us." Adrian stared at him. "For what reason? The board has requested your presence in the executive conference room." The officer gestured toward a side elevator, normally reserved for audit reviews. Not the executive lift Adrian used every day. The lobby stayed silent as he followed them down the hallway. No one stepped forward to help him. For the first time since Adrian became CEO, the building simply watched. Someone near the entrance quietly lifted a phone. Recording. Within minutes, the news moved through the building. Adrian Vale had been escorted upstairs. Not invited. Escorted. By the time I reached the conference floor, the board meeting had already resumed. Inside the room, Adrian sat at the far end of the table while the chairman read the formal notice, effective immediately. You are suspended as Chief Executive Officer pending completion of the governance review. No one reacted. No one argued. At the side of the room, an HR director quietly collected Lena Mercer's company laptop. Her access had already been revoked. Across the table, Colin sat motionless. For once, he had nothing to say. The chairman eventually turned toward me. "Miss Heller," he said, "if the board restores the project to your leadership today," he paused, "can you still save Asterion?" The chairman didn't rush me for an answer. The room stayed quiet while everyone watched. "If the project comes back to me," I said finally, "then everything that was changed outside process gets reversed." "What specifically?" one director asked. "The team structure, vendor communication lines, project authority." I looked directly at the chairman. "And no more interference from the CEO's office." A few people exchanged glances. Then the chairman nodded. Understood. Just like that, the board moved on. By noon, the internal announcement reached every employee at MedAccess. Adrian Vale has been suspended as CEO pending the completion of a governance investigation. Another line followed. The internship contract of Lena Mercer has been terminated effective immediately. And one more. The Office of the Chief of Staff is cooperating with an internal review. The building reacted the way companies always do when power shifts overnight. Quiet conversations, closed doors. People who avoided eye contact yesterday suddenly stopped by my office. "Glad you're still here." Looks like the board fixed things. Across the floor, Adrian's office lights stayed off. Outside the company, the story began moving faster. Financial reporters started calling the communications department. No one needed the full scandal. Emergency board action and governance investigation were enough to make analysts nervous. especially when the company's CEO disappeared from public view in the middle of a strategic rollout. That same afternoon, another development quietly surfaced. Victoria Vale filed for divorce, not through a dramatic press release. Through a legal filing, clean, precise, almost administrative, because the Vale family holding trust MedAccess's controlling shareholder remained under her authority as trustee, and Adrian's compensation agreement contained the clause Margaret had highlighted the night before, the clawback provision, unvested shares, deferred bonuses, executive severance, all of it tied to governance compliance. When the board confirmed the breach, most of those benefits would vanish. The man who believed he owned the company now stood as something very different, a suspended executive, facing investigation, facing divorce, facing the quiet judgment of the same building that once moved when he walked through it. I didn't celebrate. I simply opened the email that arrived near the end of the day. A formal notice from the board. One line stood out. Asterion will proceed under your direct leadership. 1 week later, I walked back into the same conference room. The same glass walls, the same long table, but the atmosphere was completely different. This time, no one was whispering. No one avoided eye contact, and no one interrupted. The chair at the center of the table was empty when I arrived. The chair that used to be mine. Now it was simply waiting. I placed my laptop down and connected it to the screen. Let's start, I said. The Asterion rollout dashboard appeared, vendor coordination restored, hospital integration rescheduled, technical deployment adjusted by 3 weeks. The leadership team leaned forward. No one questioned the timeline. One of the hospital partners joined through video. We reviewed the board's governance actions. He said, "We're comfortable continuing." Another partner nodded. Transparency matters more than speed. That was all the reassurance the room needed. Asterion moved forward again, the way it should have from the beginning. By then, the rest of the story had already settled into quiet facts. Adrian Vale was formally removed as CEO. The board cited governance failure. Lena Mercer disappeared from the company almost as quickly as she had appeared in it. Colin Price submitted his resignation before the audit report was even finalized. No one argued with the outcome. The system had corrected itself. After the meeting ended, I walked down the glass corridor toward my office. I passed the spot where, only days earlier, I'd watched an intern sit in the chair that used to be mine. Now the hallway was quiet. I took the seat and opened the meeting. Back in the conference room, the chair at the center of the table belonged to the person responsible for the project again. And this time, no one in the room questioned why. Not the loudest voice, not the most powerful title, just the one accountable for the work. Later that afternoon, a colleague paused in my doorway. "Can I ask you something?" Sure. When did everything actually start collapsing for him? I looked at the Asterion timeline on my screen, then answered calmly. A company doesn't enter a crisis when the press reports it. It enters a crisis the moment someone in charge decides their personal interests matter more than their responsibility. I closed my laptop. Because in business, people think power is the right to take. Most of the time, it's simply the duty not to abuse it. And as usual, this story is a work of fiction, created by our editorial team for storytelling purposes. All characters, events, and organizations are fictional. Any resemblance is purely coincidental. If you enjoy stories about accountability, leadership, and the quiet consequences of power, consider subscribing and sharing the video so more people can find the channel. 30 seconds. That's how long it took for a $1.5 billion expansion deal to begin collapsing. Not because of a market crash, not because of a competitor, but because the CEO's son stood up in the middle of a boardroom and tried to remove the wrong person. The meeting had been calm moments earlier. Executives reviewing the operational timeline that would determine whether Vale Industries' international expansion moved forward. My name is Celeste Rowan. I'm 47, and for nearly 2 decades, I've worked inside Vale Industries, designing the operational systems that make very large deals actually function. More importantly, I designed the framework the lenders required before releasing the $1.5 billion funding for this expansion. If everything works, people like me stay invisible. If something breaks, suddenly everyone remembers who built the structure holding the deal together. That morning, we were reviewing compliance milestones when the conference room doors opened. Adrian Vale walked in late. 2 things about Adrian were immediately obvious. First, he was 21. Second, he walked into rooms as if they already belonged to him. Behind him stood Ethan Cross, the CEO's chief of staff, the executive assigned to mentor Adrian while he learned the business. Adrian dropped into his chair and skimmed the summary page. This rollout is too slow, he said. Move the international launch forward 2 quarters. That violates the lender reporting sequence. I said, compliance reviews aren't finished. Adrian leaned back. We'll deal with that later. You can't, I replied. The deal structure doesn't allow the chair legs scraped across the floor. Adrian stood. If she won't support the plan, he said casually, remove her from the expansion project. The room went quiet. Then he added, if necessary, security can escort her out. Across the table, CEO Leonard. Vale shifted in his chair. Adrian, he said quietly, that's not how we handle this. But no one else spoke. And in corporate rooms like that, silence can be dangerous because silence means people are waiting to see who actually has power. What Adrian didn't understand yet was something simple. The $1.5 billion expansion didn't move forward because someone approved it. It moved forward because the lenders trusted the system behind it, a system I had designed. Adrian Vale joined the company 6 months earlier. The announcement came during a quarterly leadership meeting. Leonard Vale stood at the front of the room and cleared his throat. My son Adrian will be joining Vale Industries, he said. He'll rotate through departments and learn the business from the ground up. From the ground up. That was the phrase. Within 2 weeks, Adrian had an office larger than several senior managers. Within 3 weeks, he had a title. Executive Development Director. No one in the company had ever held that role before. Titles like that sound harmless until someone starts using them. Adrian wasn't incompetent. He read financial summaries quickly and liked aggressive strategies. The problem wasn't intelligence, the problem was restraint. During one of our early planning sessions, he tapped the revenue forecast with a pen. These numbers are conservative, he said. Increase the projection. They match our supply capacity. I replied, if we inflate them, we miss delivery targets. Adrian shrugged, then fixed the supply chain, like that's not how operations works. A thin smile crossed his face. It will when I'm running it. That became the pattern. Adrian pushed reckless ideas. I quietly corrected them before they reached investors. He bypassed compliance. I routed documents back through legal. For months, I told myself I was protecting the company. What I didn't realize at first was that someone else was protecting Adrian. Ethan Cross. Officially, Ethan was the CEO's chief of staff. Unofficially, he was the person responsible for smoothing out Adrian's mistakes before they reached Leonard Vale. Whenever Adrian crossed a line, Ethan stepped in. Not to challenge him, to fix the damage. Which meant Leonard saw a very different version of his son's performance. Adrian saw something else entirely. One afternoon after a meeting, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me. You know this company is already mine, he said casually, his voice carried no doubt. Because when someone grows up surrounded by people fixing their mistakes, they eventually stop believing mistakes exist. And when a person has never heard the word no, they start believing power is something they were born with. Adrian's order in the conference room should have triggered a debate. Instead, it triggered silence. And silence in corporate environments can be more dangerous than open conflict, because silence means people are waiting to see where power moves next. Within 24 hours, I began noticing changes. 3 meetings disappeared from my calendar. 2 members of my operations team were reassigned, and when I tried to open the expansion documents that afternoon, my access had been restricted. That was the moment I understood Adrian's strategy. He wasn't trying to remove me loudly, he was trying to erase me quietly. I ran into Ethan Cross outside the strategy office later that evening. System issue, I asked, nodding toward the access restriction. Ethan gave a polite smile. Temporary restructuring, he said. Adrian wants a more agile rollout structure. Agile? That was the corporate word people used when they were breaking things faster than they could fix them. And my team, I asked, still involved, Ethan said smoothly. Just under different supervision. Different supervision. Adrian's. Across the hallway, executives moved past the glass walls, pretending not to notice the conversation. Everyone had heard what happened in the meeting. Everyone knew Adrian had tried to remove me, but no one wanted to challenge the CEO's son. That night, I opened the archive folder on my laptop. For years, I had kept records of operational directives, approval logs, email chains, compliance notes. Large deals leave paper trails, and when systems break, memory becomes unreliable. Documents don't. I began organizing the timeline. Adrian's directives, the reporting changes, the compliance steps he wanted skipped, and the instruction that had started everything. Move the launch forward 2 quarters. Adrian had never bothered to read the lender agreement, which meant the people who actually understood that deal were about to start asking questions. 30 minutes after the access restrictions appeared, my phone rang. Ms. Rowan. The CEO's assistant said carefully, "Mr. Vale would like to see you." Of course he would. Leonard Vale's office overlooked half the city. When I stepped inside, he stood behind his desk staring at a thin HER document. Ethan Cross stood near the window. Neither man looked comfortable. I recognized the format immediately. An internal reassignment memo, corporate language designed to turn controversial decisions into procedural ones. Leonard cleared his throat. Celeste, given the tension surrounding the expansion project, we may need to adjust leadership responsibilities temporarily. He never said remove. Executives rarely do. They prefer words like restructure. I let the silence stretch, then I spoke. You can remove me from the project if you want. Both men looked up, but the lenders might reconsider releasing the $1.5 billion expansion funding if that happens. The room changed instantly. Leonard's eyes lifted from the memo. Across the office, Ethan turned away from the window. What exactly are you saying? Leonard asked. I'm saying the expansion doesn't move forward just because someone signs an HR memo, I replied. The lenders approved the deal based on a specific operational framework, compliance sequencing, risk certification, and reporting controls. Ethan stepped closer. And the person who designed that framework, I said calmly, is sitting in front of you. For a moment, no one spoke. Leonard's expression tightened. If the architect of that system is removed immediately after blocking a directive that violates the structure, I continued, the lenders have the right to review whether governance around the deal is still stable. Ethan understood immediately. Meaning, Leonard said slowly, they could review the funding. Exactly. The memo on his desk suddenly looked far less useful. Because this was no longer a conversation about removing an employee. It was about whether Vale Industries had just put $1.5 billion at risk. And investors rarely stay patient when governance starts looking unstable. By the end of the afternoon, a different version of events was already spreading across the executive floor. It didn't start with accusations. It started with language. A short internal note appeared in leadership channels. Recent operational discussions indicate resistance to the new leadership direction. Resistance, not compliance risk. Not lender obligations, just resistance. Inside large companies, reputations rarely collapse overnight. They dissolve quietly. The message came from Monica Pierce, Senior HR Director. Monica understood something essential about corporate survival. The safest place to stand is beside whoever still holds power. Across the building, Adrian was pushing for something simpler. She's slowing the expansion down, he told Monica during a call. Remove her from the project. Meanwhile, Ethan Cross was already trying to control the damage. Let's slow the language, he told HR quietly. This doesn't need to turn into a retaliation issue. He wasn't defending me. He was protecting the company from a very specific legal word. Retaliation. That evening, I opened the archive folder on my laptop again. For years, I had kept records of operational directives, approval logs, email chains, compliance notes. Large deals leave paper trails, and paper trails rarely stay buried. I began assembling the timeline. Adrian's directives, the reporting changes, the compliance steps he wanted skipped. Then I attached the files to a single email, 3 recipients, the general counsel, the chairman of the board, and Leonard Vale. I read the message one last time before sending it, because once that email left my outbox, the narrative Adrian's team was trying to build about me would no longer be the only story circulating inside Vale Industries. And when $1.5 billion in investor capital is involved, new stories tend to travel very quickly. The first reply arrived early the next morning. It came from the office of the general counsel. 2 sentences. We've received your documentation. Our team is reviewing the material now. That was enough. Large deals leave trails, and legal teams know how to follow them. By mid-morning, the legal department had already pulled the expansion agreement from the archive. The international rollout had taken 18 months to negotiate. Lenders, regulators, regional partners, every step documented, every condition verified. The lawyers started with the operational framework, the same framework Adrian wanted to bypass. 20 minutes later, someone from legal called Ethan Cross. We need clarification, the attorney said. About what Ethan asked. Continuity of operational oversight. The phrase sounded technical, but Ethan understood immediately where the conversation was heading. Buried inside the lender documentation was a governance clause tied directly to the expansion framework. It didn't mention my name, it didn't need to. The clause referred to the architect responsible for designing and maintaining the reporting structure, which happened to be me. Under normal circumstances, if that role changed, lenders would simply be notified. But the clause had a second condition. If the architect of the framework was removed immediately after raising a risk concern, the lenders had the right to review whether governance around the deal had become unstable. And unstable governance makes investors nervous. Later that afternoon, the legal team raised the issue with Leonard Vail. "We're not canceling the deal," Leonard said carefully. "No," the general counsel replied. "But the lenders may want to understand why the architect of the framework was removed. And if they do," Leonard asked, the attorney didn't hesitate. "Then they'll decide whether they still trust the people running this company." For the first time since Adrian had walked into that conference room, this situation stopped looking like an internal disagreement, because it was no longer about personnel. It was about whether Vail Industries had just put $1.5 billion at risk. The emergency board session began at 8:40 that evening. No announcement, no press release, just a quiet message sent to the directors asking them to join an urgent meeting on the 32nd floor. When I arrived, the long conference table was already half full. At the head of the room sat Gideon Price, chairman of the board. Leonard Vail sat to his right. Adrian sat beside his father, leaning back in his chair with visible irritation. Across the table, the general counsel began presenting the timeline, the executive meeting, the directive to accelerate the rollout, my objection regarding the lender compliance structure, and finally, Adrian's instruction to remove me from the project. The presentation was calm, dates, emails, exact wording. When it ended, Gideon folded his hands. Before anyone could speak, another document appeared on the screen, a short message from one of the lead lenders funding the expansion. The room read the sentence in silence. Why was the architect of the operational framework removed immediately after raising a risk concern? Adrian scoffed. "This is ridiculous," he said. "She's exaggerating everything to protect her job." No one answered. "That deal will move forward whether she's here or not," he added sharply. Gideon studied him for a moment. Then the chairman spoke. "This is not a family dispute." The room went still. "This," Gideon continued, "is a governance failure." The words landed like a verdict. Shareholder risk doesn't care about family pride. Gideon turned toward Leonard Vail. "Were you aware of the instruction given that morning?" Leonard hesitated. That pause said everything. Several directors exchanged quiet looks across the table. For the first time since Adrian had entered the company, the balance of power in that room began shifting away from the Vail family. And Adrian Vail was about to hear something he had never heard before. No. The message arrived the next morning. It didn't come from inside the company. It came from the lender consortium funding the expansion. 3 short paragraphs. No accusations. No dramatic language. Just a notice. Pending clarification regarding governance stability, capital authorization for the Vail Industries international expansion will be temporarily frozen. Which meant one thing. The $1.5 billion OS deal had stopped moving. Within minutes, the finance floor felt different. Phones began ringing. Treasury teams rushed between offices. Someone printed the lender notice and carried it down the hallway like it might change while they walked. Nobody said the word panic out loud, but everyone felt it. Deals that size don't freeze over rumors. They freeze when investors start questioning the judgment of the people running the company. Upstairs, the executive floor was far less controlled than usual. Adrian Vail stormed into Ethan Cross's office without knocking. "You told me this was handled." Adrian snapped. "Fix it." Ethan didn't answer immediately. For months, he had been the person who quietly repaired Adrian's mistakes, the executive who made problems disappear before they reached the board. This time was different. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "I can't," he said simply. Adrian stared at him as if the words didn't make sense. A few hours later, the board released its own decision. Until the governance review was complete, Adrian Vail was suspended from all operational authority inside Vail Industries. The notice was brief, clear, final. For the first time since he had entered the company, Adrian Vail no longer had the authority to walk into the executive conference room and take a seat at the table. And the people holding $1.5 billion in capital were now watching every move the company made next. Chapter 9. The Cost of Protecting the Wrong Person. The board's decision came 2 days after the deal freeze, not through rumors, not through internal gossip, through a formal announcement sent to every senior executive inside Vail Industries. The message was short. The board had completed its preliminary governance review and determined that recent leadership actions had exposed the company to unacceptable fiduciary risk. Those words carried weight, because fiduciary failure isn't a mistake, it's a breach of trust. The first name in the announcement was Adrian Vail. The board concluded that his directive to remove operational leadership after a compliance objection represented an abuse of authority incompatible with corporate governance standards, effective immediately. Adrian Vail was removed from all leadership roles within Vail Industries. The second name followed shortly after, Leonard Vail. The board determined that Leonard had failed to intervene when the incident occurred and later attempted to contain the situation rather than correct it. His resignation as CEO was requested and accepted that same afternoon. But the third decision surprised many people in the room, because the board added one more name, Ethan Cross. For months, Ethan had quietly repaired Adrian's mistakes, correcting reports, softening consequences, preserving the illusion that the system was working. The board described it differently, enabling leadership failure. Later that evening, Leonard asked to speak with me. He stood in my office for a long moment before finally speaking. I should have stopped him years ago. There was no anger in his voice, just exhaustion. Because companies rarely collapse because of one arrogant decision. They collapse when someone in power spends too long refusing to say no. And Leonard Vail had waited far too long. 3 months later, Vail Industries looked almost the same from the outside, at the same glass tower, the same name above the entrance, the same executives moving through the lobby every morning, but the structure inside had changed. After the governance review, the board moved quickly. Leadership responsibilities were reorganized. Oversight committees expanded. Several practices that had once relied on informal authority were rewritten into permanent policy. One of the first reforms was an anti-nepotism rule for executive appointments. No family member could enter a leadership role without independent board approval. Another required executive override logging. Any directive that bypassed operational procedures now had to be documented and reviewed, systems that should have existed years earlier. Once those reforms were in place, the lender consortium lifted the freeze on the international expansion. The $1.5 billion deal moved forward again. Not long after that, the board asked me to oversee strategic integration for the expansion. It wasn't presented as a reward, it was presented as stability. One afternoon, a junior operations manager stopped me near the elevator. I heard about what happened earlier this year, she said. How did you stay so calm? I thought about the meeting, the silence, the moment Adrian told the room to remove me. I wasn't calm. I said, I was prepared. Later that evening, I walked past the same conference room where it had started. The chairs were arranged exactly the same way. But one seat at the table was empty. And the nameplate in front of the expansion project now carried a different name. Because power rarely collapses because of enemies. It collapses when too many people become comfortable saying yes to the wrong person. And this time, someone finally said no. Stories like this don't only happen in boardrooms. Sometimes they happen in much smaller rooms. A meeting table, an office hallway, a moment when someone with power gives an order and the room goes quiet. Most of the time, nothing changes. People look down at their notes. Someone clears their throat. And the moment passes. But every once in a while, someone in that room remembers something important. That systems don't collapse because one person is arrogant. They collapse when everyone else decides silence is easier. So, I'm curious. If you had been sitting at that table the morning Adrian gave that order and the entire room went quiet, what would you have done? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about power, leadership, and the quiet moments that change everything, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. There's always another story waiting behind the next boardroom door.